The cabin of Flight 329 buzzes with quiet chatter. Passengers settle in for the long journey, flipping through magazines or staring out the windows at the endless expanse of clouds. Emily Carter sits by the window, jotting notes in her journal for an upcoming article. The faint hum of the engines is soothing, and the atmosphere feels routine, safe. Suddenly, a slight jolt ripples through the plane. Most passengers barely notice, but Emily looks up, sensing something unusual. The captain's calm voice breaks over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." But Emily notices the flight attendants exchanging uneasy glances. The jolt becomes a shudder, and the plane lurches violently to one side. Overhead bins pop open, scattering luggage across the aisle. Panic erupts as passengers grasp for stability. The captain's voice, now strained, announces, "Brace for impact! Brace for impact!" Emily's heart pounds as she locks eyes with the man sitting across the aisle, both silently acknowledging the gravity of the moment. Her thoughts race: family, unfinished dreams, and raw fear. The plane begins to nosedive, and a deafening roar fills the cabin. Oxygen masks drop from the ceiling, and Emily struggles to secure hers as the world blurs around her. She clutches the seat in front of her, counting the seconds as the ground rushes up to meet them. When Emily regains consciousness, the world is eerily silent. Smoke and the smell of burning metal fill the air. She's still strapped to her seat, tilted at an odd angle. Around her, debris is scattered like fallen leaves, and cries for help punctuate the quiet. Disoriented but alive, Emily unfastens her seatbelt and stumbles out of the wreckage. She finds herself in a dense forest, the broken fuselage of the plane embedded in the earth like a twisted sculpture. Survivors, bloodied and dazed, gather in small groups, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Emily takes a deep breath, pushes down her panic, and begins checking on others. A child cries nearby, and she rushes to comfort them, realizing that survival now depends on teamwork and courage. Days later, Emily and a handful of survivors huddle around a makeshift fire. Exhaustion weighs heavily on them, but a flicker of hope arises as the distant thrum of helicopter blades breaks the silence. They rush into a clearing, waving scraps of bright clothing to signal their location. The moment rescue teams arrive, a wave of emotion washes over Emily. Relief, grief, and gratitude intermingle as she collapses into the arms of a paramedic. As she's airlifted to safety, she looks back at the crash site, now a graveyard of memories, vowing to tell the story of courage and survival. The cold wind bit at Emily's cheeks as she stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the charred remains of Flight 329. Her breath hung in the night air, shallow and uneven. It had been hours since the crash, but the reality of their situation still felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Around her, the other survivors worked in quiet determination, gathering what little they could salvage from the wreckage: blankets, bottles of water, and pieces of metal that could serve as makeshift tools. Emily's hands trembled as she pulled a scarf from her bag and wrapped it around a young girl sitting near the fire they'd managed to start. The girl, no more than 8 years old, had been traveling with her parents, who were nowhere to be found. The child clung to Emily like a lifeline, her wide eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "Don't worry," Emily whispered, though her voice cracked under the weight of her own fear. "We'll get through this. Help is coming." But would it? The thought gnawed at her. They had no way of knowing if the emergency beacon had activated during the crash or if their location had been noticed before the plane went down. The forest around them was dense, and the hills seemed to rise and fall endlessly, cloaking them in isolation. An older man, his arm crudely bandaged with a strip of cloth, approached Emily. "We need to figure out how to make a signal," he said, his voice rough but steady. "If there's anyone flying overhead, we've got to give them something to see." Emily nodded, forcing herself to focus. "We can use the reflective surfaces from the wreckage. The moonlight might catch it." "Good idea," he said, turning to relay the plan to a few others. As they worked together to position pieces of metal in the clearing, Emily couldn't help but notice the mix of personalities emerging among the survivors. There were those like the older man, calm under pressure and eager to help, and others who seemed paralyzed by shock, unable to contribute. A woman in a business suit sat motionless near the fire, her eyes fixed on nothing, while a younger man paced back and forth, muttering to himself. "Hey," Emily said gently, approaching the woman. "You should try to stay warm. We might be here for a while." The woman blinked as if waking from a trance. I was supposed to land tonight. My husband is waiting for me. He doesn't even know." Her voice trailed off, and tears began to stream down her face. Emily crouched beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll make it back. You'll see him again." It was a promise Emily wasn't sure she could keep, but she knew they needed hope as much as they needed food and warmth. The hours dragged on, and fatigue weighed heavily on them all. Emily's muscles ached from the effort of moving debris, and her throat was dry despite rationing the small amount of water they'd found. Still, she refused to let herself rest for long. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of the plane plummeting toward the ground replayed in her mind, the screaming, the chaos, the feeling of utter helplessness. Around midnight, the sound of distant movement stirred the group. Emily froze, her heart leaping with a mix of fear and anticipation. Was it an animal? Another survivor? Or, against all odds, rescue? The older man cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted into the darkness. "Hello? Is someone there?" A moment later, a beam of light cut through the trees, and the group collectively exhaled. A rescue team had arrived. Relief flooded Emily as the rescuers stepped into view, their uniforms unmistakable. They moved quickly, assessing injuries and distributing supplies. One of them, a woman with kind eyes and a steady voice, knelt in front of Emily. "Are you hurt?" the rescuer asked. Emily shook her head, unable to speak for a moment. "No, but there's a child over there. She needs help." The rescuer nodded and signaled to a colleague. As the team worked to stabilize the survivors and prepare them for evacuation, Emily felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude. They were going to make it out. Later, as she sat in the warmth of the helicopter, wrapped in a blanket and sipping a cup of water, Emily stared out the window at the crash site fading into the distance. She thought of the lives lost and the bonds formed in the wake of the tragedy. She thought of the promises she'd made, to herself, to the little girl, to the grieving woman, and resolved to keep them. For Emily, the crash would not define her as a victim. It would be the moment she found her strength. And as the helicopter carried her and the others towards safety, she knew she would carry the story of Flight 329 with her forever, a story of survival, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit.